So just beginning with the occipital lobes at the back of the brain. So you can see how they have been separated from the other parts of the brain by further sulci, right? And then if we were to cut in between the hemispheres and we were to look inside of the brain where the occipital lobe is, then we see the occipital lobe is going to sit just above the cerebellum, because we know that the cerebellum is posterior at the back of the brain. Right, and then here we can see a big fissure there called the calcarine fissure. And this is the seat of the primary visual cortex. So this is where our visual information is processed. And what's interesting about the sensory information that comes into the brain is that our primary cortices are almost as far as possible from the senses. So for example, with the occipital lobes, our eyes sit on the front of our head, whereas the occipital lobe is at the back of the head. And the reason for this then is that when we move away from the primary cortices, when the senses move away from the primary cortices, there's a lot more elaboration and integration with other senses. And so what we're processing visually then, by the time it gets to the visual cortex, has really gone through a lot of other integration with other sensory information. All right, and then if we take a look at that lateral fissure, so it's really difficult to miss. It's this huge groove on the side of the cortex that then allows us to separate out our temporal lobe from the rest of the brain. So the temporal lobes sit on either side of our cortex, and they are responsible for a huge amount of functions, which we'll speak about a bit later. But also very importantly is that the superior temporal cortex, so the top part of our temporal cortex, is the seat of the auditory cortex. So where we're taking in verbal information. And so here, if we look on the enlarged image, we've got our lateral fissure, and then we've got that superior part there so the top of the temporal lobe is our primary auditory cortex. And this sits right near Wernicke's area, which is the area of the brain that is responsible for the comprehension of language. So we can see there also the primary auditory cortex and the comprehension of language areas in the brain are sitting closely together because they're so closely related. And then the rest of that space there is the auditory association cortex. All right, and then if we're looking again at our lateral fissure and our central sulcus, we now want to go slightly posterior to the central sulcus and above the lateral fissure, anterior to the temporal lobe, and then we have our parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is home to the somatosensory association cortex and the post-central gyrus. So if we are looking now at that central gyrus, so that groove that runs from the top of the brain all the way down almost to the lateral fissure on the side of the brain, then if we look at the gyrus, so that's the hill that falls slightly behind that, the post-central gyrus, that is our primary somatosensory cortex. So what that means is that's the part of the brain that is taking in all the information that has been processed in our senses and then mapping it onto different areas in our body and then allowing the brain to respond to anything that's happening to us in our environments. And then now as we head more towards the frontal lobe, we're just looking on the other side of the central sulcus. So once again, the central sulcus runs from the top of the brain all the way almost down to the lateral fissure, and everything that's in front of that all the way to the front of the brain is then our frontal lobes. And so here in the gray is known as the precentral gyrus. Okay, so the precentral gyrus it's that hill that sits just before the central sulcus, as opposed to the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe that we just spoke about. These two gyri sit right next to each other and they're in communication all the time because the precentral gyrus is our motor cortex. So we also have a whole lot of kind of representation of our bodies on that precentral gyrus that corresponds to what's happening on the post-central gyrus. And so what that means then is that if I was to touch a hot stove, the stimulation that is going through my hand at that stage, which would effectively be pain, I imagine, and heat, would then go to my brain. It would be processed in the somatosensory cortex. it will tell the motor cortex, this is painful, this is hot, and the motor cortex will then result in me moving my hand away. And if you think about how fast that happens, then it really gives you an idea about the communication between these two different gyri in the different lobes of the brain and how important that communication is for our everyday functioning. And then as we sort of head more anterior in terms of the frontal lobes, so our functioning starts to get more and more sophisticated. So as we're sort of heading more towards the anterior part, so you can see there the kind of lighter part of the brain, that is our prefrontal cortex. So now we're speaking quite specifically about an area of the frontal lobe that is responsible for certain functions, and that these are the functions that predominantly make us human. But one very important one is that if we sort of look on the lower part of the back of the prefrontal cortex, we have an area here that is defined quite clearly called Broca's area. And Broca's area is only on the left-hand side of the brain because it's responsible for language, and Broca's area is specifically responsible for the production and expression of speech. And so that then sits there in the frontal lobe, not far from Wernicke's area, which we spoke about in the temporal lobe, which is for the understanding and the comprehension of speech. So these two structures are very related, but they do sit separately in the brain, one in the frontal lobe and one in the temporal lobe. So now if we put everything that we just described together, then this is effectively how we would divide up the cerebral cortex.